Hello, and welcome to the Art of Divergence podcast. I am Sammy.
I'm Heather.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about ADHD gender sex differences in males and females. We're going to jump back and forth between childhood and adults, presentations, characteristics, implications, things like that. But before we get into that, Heather.
So as always, the information provided on this podcast is intended for informational and entertainment purposes, does not act as a substitute for the diagnosis and treatment of mental health concerns.
And the only check-in I have today is that I'm mega congested from being sick this week because my whole house decided to get sick and I was on the tail end of that. Other than that, I'm doing pretty good. Heather, how about you?
Doing pretty good. Not feeling under the weather like you, which I hope you feel better soon because I know that's been going around for everybody. But Ohio weather, it doesn't know what it wants to do. It's 55 one day and then it's 18 the next. And what a perfect storm for, anybody who is sensitive to allergies or sickness, anything like that.
Or temperature regulation with ADHD.
True.
I woke up and it was snowing and I was like, oh, awesome. I'm going to feel like crap today. My body is not going to want to do a thing. Anyways, so our first topic that we want to get into is talking about stereotypes of the gender presentations we see for ADHD. And one note I want to make about that is, first off, I feel like I really don't relate to a lot of these stereotypes or experiences when it comes to the female experience. So it's definitely been a learning experience for me as someone who doesn't totally fit that stereotype. It was also hard for me, but kind of affected me differently, not necessarily in a better way. So when we talk about, and I'll get into that later about, what the differences were for me and what they can be like for people who maybe see these stereotypes and don't necessarily fit them, but still have a difficult experience. The factors that affect stereotypes are things like gender roles, culture and social pressures, early hormone development when we're talking about kids, and like the overall sex-related development speed differences. So we know that in some areas, girls are developing faster than boys. Some boys just like differently than girls. So a lot of that can have an effect on what we see about how their brains are working. Some things also, unfortunately, are misogyny and harmful expectations of masculinity and how whatever culture the individual is participating in is getting affected by those things. I also want to make a note that racism has a lot to do with how Black and brown children are viewed in the stereotypes of ADHD. I think there is a lot more attention to things like what we would call aggression or conduct issues or disrespect or things that don't fit our norm of, I guess, like white American culture as some people expect it. And I think it's important to also know that, with any sort of culture, there's going to be gender differences and differences in gender roles and expectations. So when we talk about the gender differences in ADHD that we're experiencing, we have pretty much a good view of white Midwestern expectations. But I think the research is kind of lacking in, or is hopefully picking up in, observing what that looks like as a whole when we factor in everybody's cultures, everybody's differences, and not making too big of a generalization of that, but understanding where the differences lie and how we can, like as assessors, as service providers, as school professionals, pay attention to those specifically. Heather, did you have anything else that you think might be important to note as what defines or goes into stereotypes before we get into what the specifics are about girls and boys, women and men, and ADHD stereotypes?
I think what you said about making sure that you're really in tune with how the culture views ADHD, hyperactivity, boys versus girls, all of that is so important. If you're an assessor, if you're a counselor, working with somebody who comes from a different culture other than your own, educate yourself, be open, ask questions, learn what they value. I think that's such a huge piece in getting an overall idea And do the research. I mean, finding research that supports that or is specific to clients with different cultural factors is important, not only to continue your education and your knowledge and help, more individuals, but also it helps one on one, hand in hand, help the client feel like you're open and you're understanding and you're willing to learn more about their lifestyle. And of course, it helps with determining, is this actually an ADHD thing or is this something else that's going on or is this just what they deem is culturally appropriate? So I think that was a huge piece to hit on. So I'm glad you said something about that. And you're right. Unfortunately, we live in a society where when we think of ADHD, our very stereotypical Midwestern view of that is somebody who is hyperactive, restless, disruptive in class, maybe noticed a lot more by teachers, but it's important because there's so much more than just those variables, and that's where we start to get into some of the gender differences where women and females tend to be a little more subtle. It goes against those stereotypical societal gender norms that we tend to see where girls are being raised to be compliant and quiet and therefore internalize a lot more than some of these experienced externalization factors that is this stereotypical idea of what ADHD is.
And related to that culture piece we're talking about, I'm reminded of an experience I have had with doing assessments, ADHD assessments, and how I see culture coming up differently, specifically for someone who is assessing ADHD specific symptoms rather than just kind of observing someone, commenting on them, being, in school with them. And on that culture piece, I'm reminded of some cultural experience when it comes to assessing that I've gotten over some of the past clients I've had. I had a client with Muslim family background, and I noticed that, in our conversations, they expressed that, well, in Muslim culture, in my experience with Muslim culture, there is not as much of an acknowledgement of mental health issues in the home, in the community. And I understand that definitely depends on which home and community that you're in. They are all different for sure. But, what we know of the general cultural presentations and from what this person was telling me, that was the truth for them. And I noticed that their symptoms came out a lot more significantly when they were self-reporting on a form rather than being observed by someone or actually reporting to me their symptoms. So, I noticed in that I need to not necessarily take it as gospel that's because they're Muslim or, that that's some sort of problem that I need to really investigate with them, but that I should be conscious and that I should be asking more questions. And that as assessors, we have to take that into account that it's not just the data we're seeing on a page, the numbers that we score, that it also has to do with what life is like for that person. And I think appropriately reporting to them what their ADHD looks like means taking that into account and not necessarily, like I said, making it a hallmark, but investigating, asking the right questions. And then I think it's important too when we're talking about especially childhood presentations of ADHD. We think about what school, parents, and society are seeing from kids like these, and a good place to start that, my mind brought me to was what kind of comments from authority are these kids hearing? Because I know what I heard. And I keep seeing this thing going around on social media of the math is a little I looked into it and the math is a little foggy, but that by age 12, kids with ADHD hear on average 100,000 more comments of judgment or negativity towards their behaviors than neurotypical kids. Have you seen this at all, Heather?
I haven't heard anything about it, but it is interesting because from my personal experience, I have noticed that for other people. I'm I consider myself a very observant person and I just kind of pick up on that and I'm like, I don't like that comment. Like that's not something that you should be commenting about. You don't know what's going on, you know?
I also, not to put anybody on on blast, but there have been parents that I've worked with in the past or people of closeness to someone with ADHD that they don't understand why they feel so judged and don't understand how all of these comments affect them when a lot of the time they're the ones making the comments. And they
Sure.
don't always realize it because essentially it is very natural to have these comments made to children and adults with these issues. So basically what came to my mind was when it comes to boys with ADHD, comments like too rowdy, boys just being boys as kind of a dismissal of symptoms, anger issues, conduct issues, being disrespectful. For girls, a lot of the time we are too sensitive because we can't emotionally regulate. Not ladylike if you have some more traditional people around you. A lot of the times disappointing or not meeting expectations or has potential.
Mm.
That's, I guess, kind of positive-ish one, but still feels negative. Are there any you can think of that when it comes to, like, gender-specific comments that you hear from boys, girls, males, females?
I don't know about you, but the one that kind of gets under my skin is don't take it so personally. Um,
Totally.
as a female and as somebody who, my mind is going all the time. I'm thinking 5 steps ahead and thinking about things that haven't even happened yet, but also I'm very in tune with how I'm being and what I'm doing. And just because I might be coming across too strong for somebody else doesn't mean, I'm being too emotional about it. I mean, everybody feels what they feel, and that is another gender difference that we tend to see with boys and girls, right? Is women are going to internalize and feel a lot of feelings, which to other people observing, especially to men, it might come across as taking things too personally. On the opposite side, you have guys that might have a hard time showing those emotions because they might come out in different external ways. And
Mhm.
therefore, you have females who might say, well, you're just not in touch with your emotions.
Mm.
So you get it from both sides. And it's just something that, it's unfortunate because when we have these little phrases that we say to people, it kind of reinforces that stereotype of there's something wrong with you or you should be doing something a certain way.
Totally. It's just like a cementing in of those negative behaviors that we see that we tell kids from the start, you're not handling your emotions correctly. So they just suppress
Right.
them or let them explode. And then it keeps going on to adulthood to the point where we're hearing, you're so emotional, or you have anger issues, or you just don't know how to feel your feelings. It's all this cycle of negative judgment that we have from external sources that really eat away at our abilities of communication and emotional expression as people with ADHD, especially. I also wanted to, like I said before, note the experience that I had that was so different from some of the stereotypes we see with younger women, little girls with ADHD. I think I was always kind of more related to, I guess maybe both, but a little more on the boy side of what gets experienced with or gets observed with them. I was always being a little too loud or having like anger issues, conduct issues, or, not being able to sit still, not being able to stop talking in class, or having, issues with other students. And when it came to home, it was always like, watch your temper and watch what you say. And I felt a lot less of maybe that's just because I could not withstand it as well as some other people and I just kind of let it explode. But I did not necessarily get that sense to be compliant and quiet. It more just turned into self-judgment because I couldn't do that because that's what I thought everyone was expecting of me. So, I don't, like I said, necessarily relate to what we generally see of most girls' experiences, which is why I think it's important to say that this doesn't apply to every single woman, girl.
Mm.
I think that everybody's experience is a little bit different, but because we're sharing hormones and gender norms and all of the gender roles and all of the things that I noted go into stereotypes, it's gonna fall into the same baskets a lot of the time.
Yeah, and that goes into kind of talking about some of the misdiagnosis that we tend to see with ADHD. For girls, you might see, that they're internalizing, so they're masking a lot more. Or as they get older, we tend to see that women will, they've got a family now, they have kids in that they have to take care of, their career, that's very much at the forefront of their mind. So they're juggling more important roles in their life. And so you might find ways that they tend to compensate or find ways to make things easier for them because, hey, anything that's going to make my life easier with all of these other obligations, I'm going to do. So it could get masked. Like anxiety and depression are two of the biggest ones we tend to see with females. And both of those tend to be a lot more internalization than externalization. With men and boys, you might see more of that shutting down or that those angry outbursts, especially as things get more chaotic as they grow up and they start to develop more things that they have to be kind of in control of. And everything tends to be shaped around society too. So if society says this is how we're supposed to be, this is typically the way that people try to be, even though it might not work for them, even though if it feels like something that's foreign to them, they're going to be like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing in this situation. I know no other way, or what else I should be doing instead. And so we just tend to continue to follow these patterns.
And I think it's also helpful when we're talking about like masking or just kind of how these symptoms force themselves out or get suppressed is that I was just thinking this in doing an assessment, how much can you really mask some ADHD symptoms? It's very
Mhm.
difficult to that's literally just how our brain works sometimes. Like that's how I feel for me. I can't imagine how to even make it work to mask some of the things that are happening in my life and what my brain is doing day to day. And I think a lot of people feel in that way also a lack of control
For sure.
with women. And as we talk about aging, managing a household, having kids, feeling that lack of control to get things out, like to get things kept in and, quiet and compliant and internally managed is so hard for a woman with ADHD.
Mhm.
And I think that results in, once again, just that cycle of shame and self judgment and poor communication on how our close people can help us and things like that. And I think the reason that it's so important for us to make this a topic of gender differences is to point out that these lead to some really harmful experiences of limiting the ability you have to get help and
Mhm.
have people around you understand you and get diagnosed and get medicated and things like that. I think it's just important to emphasize that, especially with what we're going to get into now, which is misdiagnosing, that we are more aware that we're allowed to feel this way and behave this way as long as it doesn't hurt anybody and as long as we make attempts, genuine attempts to accept ourselves and our brains and manage, it's okay. And as we're talking about misdiagnosis, I think a lot of us in the field are familiar with how, even from the start, girls get misdiagnosed. And, we talked about all of that, keeping it in. That results in a lot of anxiety. That results in depression, the spiraling we do internally trying to keep all of this stuff together presents in the exact symptoms you see with someone who is anxious and depressed. And anxiety and depression can come from a lot of different places, obviously. But when it is from something about how your brain works that needs to be acknowledged first, it is definitely what we would call a misdiagnosis.
Mhm. Yeah, so in addition to like masking and juggling more roles, you'll tend to see females will overcome compensate or develop prosocial behaviors to compensate for the inattentiveness. Um, might look like people pleasing or poor boundaries even.
I
They
think you could also say maybe social anxiety.
oh yeah,
Um, I think even like OCD related behaviors,
sure.
sometimes like hyper fixations on masking or things like that. It doesn't necessarily completely transfer in that way, but like symptoms, and I'll make a note of that later as we talk about more relevant information on misdiagnosing or underdiagnosing. But as far as emotional dysregulation goes as well, we can see like mood disorder symptoms. We can see I just was talking with someone who is like it was very difficult to figure out whether they wanted to pursue a bipolar assessment or an ADHD assessment because they felt like their brain was so loud all the time and they really couldn't figure out between the symptoms of mania and the symptoms of ADHD, hyperactive, which one fit them better. The key there is usually the timing of the symptoms, of
Yeah.
course, that we know. but but yeah, it can be things like other mood and personality related disorders that can look so similar.
And even substance use. I
Oh,
know
good
I've
one.
had a lot of clients who will say, I just focus a lot better when, I hit my dab pen or I have a little bit of marijuana. Yes, it can help you focus. It can help things feel relaxed and calm. And so if you're doing that to get through things, right, it's a sign that, hey, there's something here that is causing this effect to allow me to focus and do what I need to do. So then is it substance abuse or is it something that is a coping skill for ADHD? And I get asked that quite a bit is, I just use this as the my medication, but also there's those other effects that you need to take into consideration.
I love that we noted that. That's so important and not something that came to my mind. So that's a good thing for me to think about as well. And then when it comes to misdiagnosis in men, we see boys getting observed and suspected for conduct disorders like
Mhm.
ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, or just general conduct disorders, which I think we all have our own thoughts about how relevant diagnoses like that are, but jury's kind of out on that one. Um,
There's a reason those insurance companies say we don't approve that diagnosis.
mm, true. But I think when it comes to older not older men, but just like adult men, there's a lot of issues with anger, a lot of issues with emotional dysregulation in the ways that it presents in men, a lot of disorganization, or sometimes people can see them as like lazy or incompetent or like these, negative judgments we have that I think it's hard for us to come up with a lot of misdiagnoses or diagnostic confusions with men because not a lot of men, well, less men than women seek these diagnoses.
True.
And I mean, I think that's just got to do with a lot of the way that our gender roles say we are supposed to act as men and women when it comes to our mental health. I think it's still, even with all of the efforts we've made and advancements we've made, less welcome and less of an option for men. And so I think it can be really important to emphasize that a collection of symptoms like this for young boys and young men are worthy of being checked out for ADHD, that this is not just the way guys are. It's not just guys being guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And reaching out for help and being like, "Hey, I've been curious about this. I just kind of thought this is how I was." But, it's the stereotype of men shouldn't be reaching out for these kind of things. They should figure it out and have it together. And there's that pressure that we put on them to reach out and be like, "Hey, like I am curious about this and it's okay to do those things."
Definitely. Very much agree. And I think when we do see people pursuing diagnoses, not necessarily knowing whether to pursue ADHD or not, and getting misdiagnosed, there are definitely impacts and implications of that for their life before or if at all they seek ADHD assessment.
Yeah, so going into some of those impacts of, like, a misdiagnosis, you might have clients who say they feel very low self-esteem. They feel like they are underachieving. They look at their peers and they say, "Why is it so hard for me? Why is it so easy for everybody else and I am having to exhaust myself with rereading things," or I can't focus on something. All of those things to take into consideration. Chronic stress, even, constantly worrying how they're appearing to other people, how they're appearing to their boss because it's taking them longer to do something, or they have to do something different in order to maintain the same productivity that their coworkers or other classmates are doing.
And I think it's so relevant to note that in observing really any behavioral issues when it comes to early childhood even or adult life, that clearing the bar of ADHD assessment is so easy. It should be such a first step, such a no-brainer of let's just cross this off. Let's just investigate it. I think people think that we still have some societal misunderstandings of how ADHD gets diagnosed and how difficult or expensive it might be. Truly, it can start with the couple questions on a screener at even school or
Mhm.
a family doctor appointment. I think that it's such a low barrier to cross before you start, especially trying to put kids or, yourself on depression or anxiety medication or put yourself through any sort of specific therapy or essentially maybe just let yourself struggle or, take yourself out of certain things because you think you have certain diagnoses that could easily be ADHD. I mean, those can be so limiting. And once again, I have to emphasize the bar is so low to clear. ADHD is an easy thing to assess for, at the very least, to see if you have significant markers enough to get a full assessment, that it should be so incredibly routine for everybody. At least that's my opinion. I think we could avoid all of this if we were able to get the medical and educational community to sign on to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, something that I was just thinking about too, in terms of misdiagnosis, is how it affects relationships and also how it affects treatment plans at school. So, kids who are on IEPs or 504s, are we working with anxiety symptoms or are we working with ADHD symptoms or depression symptoms? Maybe it's all three. But having that misdiagnosis and, following a plan that might not actually be what's true for you might hit on some of the things that are wrong, but won't get to the root problem because you're not focusing on the correct thing.
Mhm.
Same thing with, relationships. How many couples come to therapy and say there is an issue with communication or emotional regulation? I do this one way, and then my partner does this completely different. And so one partner thinks it might be anxiety, and the other person's like, no, actually, it's trauma. And so sometimes just having those, being on completely different pages and having a misdiagnosis can really alter the forward progress in therapy, in school, in relationships. And so it's so important to understand everything that's kind of going on and making sure you're meeting the client with your where they're at, understanding the full extent to what their experience is, to rule out these other things and really give them a treatment plan that they can follow, that they know, like, yes, this is actually what's going on. Here's what I can do in my relationship and that I can inform my partner about so we can do better in therapy together and be stronger as a couple.
So agree. Those are good areas to go over when it comes to how misdiagnosis might really get in the way of progress and things that I think we should absolutely revisit in other episodes. But I mean, one last thing about ADHD assessments that I don't want to fail to mention is that in a full assessment, we are screening for depression, we are screening for anxiety, ADHD, trauma, OCD, other things that get confused with ADHD, so that if ADHD is the misdiagnosis, we can cover that as well. It's not it's not difficult to get all of these things crossed off all at once or, investigated. And so I think it's important to know that once again, it's a very low effort start to investigating some of these behavioral differences and difficulties that we see kids and adults face. And we want to continue the conversation about these gender differences further, how it applies to adult life, different aspects of relationship, anything and everything when it comes to gender differences. We are going to continue this episode with a part 2, potentially more parts. We'll see how long the conversation goes. And that's where we're going to end it. This has been The Art of Divergence. I am Sammy.
I'm Heather.
And we are part of Neurodivergent Ohio. We are a counseling, assessment, and community building practice operating out of Ohio. If you would like more information on that practice, please check out our links in our descriptions. And we hope to have you listening on our second part. Have a nice day.